Salam, peace be upon you. My name is Muhammad Laiq Siddiqui, the father of Holophase. Remember the language we are learning. There is one field, phi, the holophase. One continuous cyclic movement from which all of reality unfolds. When phi begins to change, its first derivatives appear, and with them, the three dimensions show themselves at once. Time as omega, space as kappa, and motion as nu, built from both. Earlier in this journey, I used the letter V for motion. From now on, I'll say nu. I cannot promise you that I will never mix them up again later, but nu keeps our symbol family cleaner and avoids collisions with other uses of V. That is all you need to know, and now we continue. This is episode 11, part 63, the license to interpret. And I want to explain it as a simple, captivating story you can carry in your pocket. Imagine Afghanistan at dusk, not as a headline, but as geography speaking in pure beauty. Mountains fold into the horizon like sleeping giants. Valleys hide between ridges like secret corridors. And rivers, clear, cold, and stubborn, cut their way through rock, carrying the memory of snow from high peaks down to orchards and plains. In that land, one lesson repeats everywhere. If you pretend the terrain is simple, the terrain will correct you. Now picture a traveler walking beside a river in a narrow valley. The water is loud, but the sky above is wide and silent. The traveler carries two things, a lantern and a map. The lantern lights a small circle of ground. Inside the circle, he can see stones, roots, puddles, and the exact edge of a drop. Outside the circle is darkness. The map, meanwhile, shows a clean line. Follow the river, climb the pass, cross the ridge, descend. Here is the first truth of part 63. The map is not the ground, and the lantern is not the valley. The map is an interpretation of the valley. The lantern is a tool for deciding where to step, and safety depends on using both, honestly. Holophase says, science is like this. The validated kernel is like the well-tested part of the map. Measurements are like lantern light. But the most dangerous moment is not when we have no map. The most dangerous moment is when we have a good map and then tell a careless story about it. When we speak beyond the circle of light as if we are still seeing. That is why the firewall needs a license to interpret, because interpretation is not free. Most people think the main question is, do we have the right equation? Holophase says, another question is just as serious. Are we telling a story about the equation that secretly adds extra meaning, ignores boundaries, or hides uncertainty? Part 63 is the engineered answer. It is the bridge from the kernel to the world, with guardrails built in. Stay with the traveler. Suppose the map says, this pass is safe. The traveler repeats that sentence and begins to climb. But the map was drawn in summer. Tonight is late autumn. Overnight, the temperature dropped, and the shaded side of the trail has thin ice like glass. The map is not lying. The map is scoped. It never promised universality. The traveler is the one who turned the scoped statement into an absolute statement. Now imagine a second traveler who never saw the map at all. He sits in a tea house and hears a confident storyteller say, that pass is easy. Anyone can cross it at night. I did it once. The room laughs. The story feels strong. But the story has no scope, no uncertainty, and no respect for changing conditions. It is confidence dressed as guidance. Holophase says, this is how good science goes bad in public. A kernel rule stripped of scope becomes a weapon. A metaphor mistaken for a rule becomes a trap. A provisional finding inflated into certainty becomes ideology.
The license to interpret exists to prevent that corruption.
So what is a license in plain terms? It is a requirement that any interpretation, any claim about what the rule means, must carry 4 kinds of honesty, the way a real mountain guide carries 4 habits of responsibility. First, kernel alignment. Your words must match the rule. Not poetically, not vaguely. The core meaning must map cleanly. Second, declared scope. You must say where it applies, what timescale in omega, what domain or structure in kappa, what motion and coupling regime in nu. Third, uncertainty bounds. You must tell people how confident the claim is. If the claim has error bars, you must not throw them away. If the claim is qualitative, you must still grade its strength honestly. Well-established, tentative, or controversial. Fourth, firewall compliance. You must not smuggle in extra primitives. You must not import mystical causes. You must not hide known exceptions when they matter. You must not pretend the metaphor is physics. If these are present, interpretation is licensed. If they are missing, it is unlicensed, no matter how beautiful, popular, or comforting it sounds. Now let's make this vivid with everyday analogies. Think of cooking. A beginner recipe says, cook on medium heat for 10 minutes. If you move kitchens, different stove, different pot, different altitude, the dish changes. The instruction had hidden scope. It assumed a specific world without admitting it. A mature recipe says, cook until the onions turn translucent and smell sweet, and the bubbling slows. That recipe aligns with observable signals. It carries scope. Onions vary, heat varies, and you must adjust. It carries uncertainty. It teaches you what to watch, not only what to count.
A licensed interpretation must be like the mature recipe.
It must be faithful to what is actually measured, and it must declare the conditions in which the instruction makes sense. Now think of medicine. A reckless healer says, this cures everything. That is interpretive overreach. Maximum claim, minimum honesty. A responsible doctor says, in this condition, for this group, at this dose, we see this effect within this range of uncertainty, and here are the known failure cases. That doctor is not weak. That doctor is safe. The license to interpret tries to make public science sound like the responsible doctor, not like the reckless healer. Now think of building. Imagine a carpenter in a bazaar making doors. His ruler is good enough for woodwork, but if you ask him to build a watch, his ruler is not licensed for that scope. The tool is not wrong. The scope is wrong. In the same way, a model can be powerful inside its license window and useless outside it. The license forces you to say which job your tool is built for. Now let's bring in the geography again. In some Afghan valleys, rivers braid. In spring melt, one channel becomes 3. A crossing point that was safe last week becomes a deep flow today. A child points and says, the river is here, as if here is permanent. An elder says, today the river is here, but it shifts. Watch the color, watch the speed, watch the depth near the stones. Cross where the flow spreads, not where it narrows. That elder is doing scope discipline. He is also carrying a shadow archive, memory of where people slipped, where sand collapsed, where a strong channel appeared without warning. A licensed interpretation does the same. It does not erase the shadow archive. It does not claim permanence where the system is known to shift. It says, within these conditions, this is what the rule supports.
Now, why does Holophase insist on this so strongly?
Because interpretation is the place where authority leaks. In a lab, scientists argue with data, methods, and uncertainty. In the world, people argue with slogans. A careful result becomes a headline like "Science proves X." Uncertainty disappears, scope disappears, triunity disappears. The kernel becomes a cartoon. Then the public sees revisions and says, "Science is flip-flopping." But what actually flip-flopped was the unlicensed story, not the licensed rule. So the firewall adds an outward-facing layer, the interpretation auditor. This role can be played by educators, journal editors, science communicators, and policy analysts trained in firewall discipline. They ask 4 questions before a claim is amplified. Is there a source kernel rule? Is the interpretation aligned? Is the scope declared? Is uncertainty communicated? If not, the claim is sent back for revision, or it is published with the warning label, "Unlicensed Interpretation." This is not censorship, it is hygiene. It is the difference between clean water and water that looks clear but carries sickness. Now let's connect this to the triunity requirement, because this is where many interpretations quietly fail even when they sound scientific. Reality is tri-locked. Omega, kappa, and nu are not optional. They are 3 shadows of the same phi structure. But popular storytelling loves single-axis narratives. Some people tell omega-only stories. Everything is just time, slow progress, deep history. They ignore spatial structure and coupling. Some tell kappa-only stories. Everything is just geometry and arrangement. They ignore rhythm and flow. Some tell nu-only stories. Everything is just motion, competition, force. They ignore distribution and timing. Holophase says, if an interpretation privileges one echo and sacrifices the others, it is not licensed. It is distortion. Here is an everyday analogy: a song. A song is not only rhythm, it is not only melody, it is not only the movement of a dancer. Rhythm is omega. Melody's pattern is kappa. The flow that carries melody through time is nu. If you describe only one, you have not described the song. You have described a slice. A licensed interpretation must keep the whole song audible, even in simple language. Now, energy. In Holophase, energy is tally. It is accounting, a derived summary of constraints inside a certified regime. That means energy is not an all-purpose mystical substance. So the firewall rule is strict. Claims about energy are permitted only within certified tally regimes. Outside them, energy can be used as metaphor, but it must be labeled as metaphor. If you are analyzing a collision, you can say kinetic energy was conserved, meaning a specific tally inside the scope. If you are describing a crowd and say the crowd had energy, that may be a useful image, but it is not the conserved quantity. The license demands you do not smuggle physics authority into poetry. This protects the public from a common kind of magical thinking where energy becomes a vague explanation for everything. Now return to the traveler again, because this story shows the license in action. The traveler reaches a fork. One path climbs directly along a cliff. The other curves down toward the river, then rises gently. He asks a guide, which is true? The guide says, both can be true, but not at the same time in all conditions. Then the guide does what licensed interpretation always does. He adds conditions. The cliff path is safe in dry weather and daylight. At night, frost forms in the shade, and a single slip can end the trip. The river curve is safer when the cliff is icy, but if the river rises after a storm, the curve can trap you. Notice what happened. The guide did not give a slogan. He gave a scoped answer. He carried uncertainty. He did not pretend the mountain owes him simplicity. That is the license to interpret. It is the habit of refusing slogans where the world demands conditions. Now, what happens when interpretation fails? Imagine a storyteller who loves applause. He says, "This pass is always safe. I crossed it once. Anyone can do it." People cheer. They feel brave. They follow him at night. Some slip. Some get lost. Then the village says, "Maps are useless," or "Knowledge cannot be trusted," or "Everyone lies." But the real failure was counterfeit interpretation, a story that borrowed authority without carrying scope and uncertainty. That is why the firewall has consequences. Interpretations that exceed scope or hide uncertainty are downgraded to speculation, regardless of popularity. They must be relabeled. If the misuse is severe and public, a correction is issued, linking back to the Kernel Rule and its proper interpretations. Again, hygiene, not punishment. Now, this framework also protects exploration. Because licensed interpretations are not meant to become dogma. If a new interpretation aligns better with data, it can earn a license. If an old one drifts, it can be downgraded. The bridge stays flexible without becoming chaotic. This is the deeper point. The firewall does not freeze meaning. It keeps meaning accountable. Now, let's make this even more personal for the listener. From part 63 onward, you gain a new reflex. When you hear someone say, "Science says," you can calmly ask, "Which rule is this based on? How do your words align with it? Where does it apply? How uncertain is it?" These questions are not rude. They are the adult form of listening. They separate knowledge from noise. And because Holophase is triunity, you also learn to ask, are you preserving omega, kappa, and nu together? Or are you telling a one-dimensional story? Now I want to end with the lantern image, because it unifies everything. Science builds lanterns, instruments, models, grammars. The validated kernel is the ground we can see clearly. The shadow archive is the rough edge where we learned caution. The undecidable zone is the darkness beyond the light, which is real but not yet decided. The license to interpret is the rule that says, you may speak confidently only within the circle of light, and you must say when you are stepping beyond it. It is the rule that prevents the kernel from becoming a cartoon, and prevents society from turning scope knowledge into absolute ideology. So part 63 is not about making you suspicious of science. It is about making you loyal to science's deepest promise. Honesty about what we know, how we know it, where it applies, and where it does not. If you want to see the full mathematical derivations and exact equations behind this idea, you can search for Holophase on Zenodo. There you will find the scientific papers that this audio journey is built on. Now, let me deepen the story with one more setting, because it helps you hear the license as something real, not abstract. Imagine a great library in a city, a place where every important instruction is stored. Not poems, not rumors, instructions that protect lives. How to build a safe roof, how to purify water, how to treat an infection, how to design a dam. In this library, the most trusted documents are stamped and filed. They are not stamped because the librarian likes them. They are stamped because they survived tests. Those stamped documents are the kernel. But the library has another room as well, the room of translations. Because most people cannot read technical documents directly. They need someone to translate the meaning into everyday language. They need teachers, journalists, and leaders to carry the knowledge into homes and schools. Here is the danger. A translation can betray the original. A careless translator can exaggerate. A lazy translator can simplify until meaning is destroyed. A biased translator can bend the message to fit a private agenda. Even a well-meaning translator can accidentally remove the warnings and conditions. So the library creates a rule. No translation may leave the building unless it is stamped to. That stamp is the license to interpret. In the Holophase firewall, a licensed interpretation is like a passport for meaning. A passport has your name, your photo, your date, and your limits. It says where you are allowed to go and for how long. If you try to enter outside your passport, you are stopped. Not because travel is evil, but because boundaries matter. A license interpretation says, these words are permitted to represent that rule, inside these conditions, with this uncertainty, for this limited scope. And just like a passport, an interpretation can expire. If the kernel rule is updated, narrowed, or downgraded, the interpretation must be rechecked. The stamp must be renewed or removed. Otherwise, society keeps using an old map in a changed world. Now let's see how this works in daily life. Think about a school classroom. A teacher wants to explain gravity. The teacher might say, if you drop a stone, it falls. That is true, but it is not the whole license meaning. Then the teacher says, heavier stones fall faster. Many children believe it, but it is not generally licensed as a statement about the kernel rule. The teacher has mixed an intuition with the rule. A good teacher, under the license, would say, they fall together unless air resistance differs. Gravity pulls on mass, and mass also resists acceleration, so the effects balance. Notice what this does. It declares scope and keeps alignment. Now think about a doctor giving medicine instructions. If the doctor says, take 2 pills daily, that is simple. But the doctor also must say, only after food, or do not mix with alcohol, or stop if you see a rash, or this works for most people, but some have reactions. Those sentences are not decoration. They are scope and shadow archive in plain language. When people ignore those conditions, they blame medicine. But the failure was the story, not the chemistry. Now think about the news. A paper says, this intervention reduces risk by about 10% with uncertainty. A headline says, miracle cure discovered. That is the moment where the firewall should step in and say, unlicensed interpretation, downgrade, relabel, correct. Not because excitement is bad, but because excitement without honesty destroys trust. Now return to Afghanistan's landscape for another analogy that fits the soul of this spot. Imagine you are looking at a mountain from far away. From a distance it looks smooth, one clean silhouette against the sky. But when you walk closer, the mountain becomes a universe. Cracks, ledges, loose stones, hidden streams, sudden cliffs. What looked like one thing is many things. A distant description can be useful. The mountain is high. But if you treat that distant description as complete, you die on the cliff. Interpretation works the same way. From far away, a scientific rule can sound like one simple sentence. Up close, the rule has conditions, regimes, exceptions, and uncertainty. A licensed interpretation is the art of speaking simply without pretending it is the whole mountain. It is saying, the mountain is high, and here is where the trail is safe, and here is where the rock breaks. Now I want to make the license even simpler by turning it into a tiny 4-question ritual you can perform whenever you hear a claim. When someone says, science says X, quietly ask. 1. What is the source rule? What exactly are we standing on? 2. What is the scope? Where and when does it apply? 3. What is the uncertainty? How strong is the evidence? 4. What is being added? Is this still aligned, or is someone smuggling meaning? If you can answer these 4, you are in licensed territory. If you cannot, you are in rumor territory.
Now, a common confusion. People think interpretation means anything goes.
Holophase means the opposite. Interpretation is the disciplined act of mapping a formal constraint into human language without corruption. Metaphors are allowed because they teach, but metaphors must be labeled as metaphors. That small honesty keeps the bridge clean. Now, notice what Part 63 does for your emotional relationship with knowledge. It frees you from the pressure to treat every scientific statement as either sacred truth or worthless uncertainty. Instead, you learn a third position, licensed claim. A licensed claim is neither worship nor dismissal. It is a scoped tool you can use responsibly. This makes you calmer. It also makes you harder to manipulate, because manipulators love absolute language. Always, never, proves. The license teaches you to ask for scope and uncertainty, and that dissolves manipulation like salt dissolves ice.
Now, let's tie the triunity back in one last time, because this is holophase and we do not forget our foundation. When you interpret, do not flatten the three shadows. Time, omega, is cadence and stability over cycles. Space, kappa, is structure and relational geometry. Motion, nu, is coupling and propagation, the way change travels through structure. A licensed interpretation keeps all three in view, even when it speaks simply. Now we close the story where we began, the traveler with the lantern. He stands by the river, he holds the map, he sees the circle of light. The license to interpret is the rule that says, speak like a traveler who respects darkness. Do not pretend the lantern lights the whole valley. Do not pretend the map is the ground. Do not turn a scoped statement into an absolute claim. Do not remove uncertainty to sound strong. Real strength is honest strength. And that is why Part 63 is one of the most important parts of the entire firewall.
It protects the kernel from being turned into a weapon. It protects society from counterfeit certainty. And it protects the spirit of science from becoming a religion. Before we end, I want one more everyday picture that makes the triunity requirement easy to hear. Imagine a rug weaver. She does not create a carpet by pattern alone. She needs rhythm in her hands and timing in her breath. And she needs the thread to move through the loom with the right tension. If she rushes the rhythm, the knots loosen. If she pulls too hard, the thread snaps. If she stares only at the design and ignores the motion of her hands, the rug becomes uneven. Pattern is kappa, rhythm is omega, and the pull and flow through the loom is nu. A licensed interpretation keeps all three together.
And one final river image. A bridge across a fast mountain river must be strong enough to carry people, but also honest about its limits. Maximum load, slippery boards in winter, repairs after flood. A licensed interpretation is that kind of bridge. Simple to cross, but engineered, labeled, and maintained. That is what it means to interpret responsibly. So when you speak to the public, you do not throw equations at them, and you do not sell them myths. You carry the stamped bridge, faithful words, clear scope, honest uncertainty. If someone asks for certainty beyond the stamp, you say calmly, not licensed there yet. That sentence keeps both truth and trust alive for all of us together. Salam and peace be upon you.